For the past 30 to 40 years in this country, we have witnessed a massive redistribution of income and wealth. Anyone who has studied the numbers, whether left wing, right wing, or anywhere in between, can see the truth in the data from the IRS and other sources. Wealth has steadily moved from the bottom and middle classes to the very top. That's why even mainstream politicians now openly acknowledge that America's middle class is dying. It's not an exaggeration. The middle has collapsed. First, the middle class has endured relentless economic blows. A devastating pandemic that rocked financial stability, soaring inflation that continues to erode purchasing power, and a stark decline in America's global standing. Over these same decades, the U.S. lost the Vietnam War, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now struggles in Ukraine. These cumulative failures have deeply rattled the working class, leaving many feeling trapped, angry, and without a clear path forward. This desperation mirrors what happened in Germany before World War II, when large parts of the working class, destabilized and disillusioned, enabled Hitler's rise not because all Germans supported him, but because enough did to let him crush his enemies and reshape the country. That history should serve as a stark warning today. This morning's headlines only add to the unease. President Trump appointed Vice President Vance to purge the Smithsonian of what they called anti-American, improper ideology. The first thing that came to my mind was the 1950s, when the House Un-American Activities Committee persecuted people for their beliefs, forcing many out of jobs and even out of the country. Back then, artists like Bertolt Brecht and Charlie Chaplin were among those hounded into exile. We now look back on that era with shame, yet we seem determined to repeat it. Will the outcome this time be different, or will it spiral into something worse, as it did in Germany? After World War II, Americans were taught to believe in American exceptionalism, that the U.S. was uniquely favored by God or destiny, destined for endless prosperity. But that myth didn't prepare us for the rise of China as a true economic competitor. Unlike Russia, which was too poor and small to rival the U.S. economically, China has grown into an $18 to $19 trillion economy, a serious challenger. Together with its allies, China has emerged as a powerful force, even as many Americans remain unaware or in denial. China's leaders understood something vital. Capitalism evolves through different phases to survive. When private enterprise alone couldn't deliver stability, governments stepped in just as the U.S. did after the 1929 crash and during World War II. But then, in the following decades, government influence was scaled back, and private interests dominated again. China charted its own course. Rather than copy the Soviet model where the government owned everything, it created a hybrid system, about half private enterprise, half state-controlled, with the Communist Party maintaining firm oversight. This model has proven extraordinarily effective, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty faster than any other country in history. Like absolute monarchies once did for feudalism, China's unique form of state-guided capitalism became capitalism's highest achievement, at least so far. What drove China's experiment wasn't a rigid ideology about socialism versus capitalism, but a desperate urgency to end poverty after a century of humiliation and underdevelopment. China's leaders recognized that ending poverty would require embracing both private initiative and strong state control, taking massive risks along the way. Fast forward to today. Europe spent 500 years preparing to compete with the US, yet it failed to match America's or China's technological power. Europe has no equivalents of Apple, Microsoft, or China's electric vehicle giant BYD, which, despite being the world's best and most affordable EV maker, can't sell cars in the US because of 100% tariffs. Even Warren Buffett owns a large stake in BYD, seeing its potential, but American protectionism blocks it. The irony is striking. US leaders promote free trade only when it benefits them. When American companies can't compete, they switch to protectionism, tariffs, and sanctions to keep out better, cheaper products. These policies may shield American firms in the short term, but they expose a deeper problem. US capitalism can no longer compete on its own merits. Our leaders used to champion free markets because America's dynamic economy always won. But now, the tables have turned and desperate measures like tariffs only raise costs for American consumers. The more the government borrows to fund corporate subsidies, the more it traps itself in unsustainable debt. This debt isn't abstract. Taxes collected from ordinary Americans increasingly go not to public services, but to pay interest on massive loans made mostly by corporations, the wealthy or foreign governments like Japan and China. So in a bizarre twist, American taxpayers fund interest payments that enrich those lenders, including geopolitical rivals. The fundamental injustice is clear. The rich and corporations use their wealth to avoid taxes, forcing the government to borrow instead. This lets them lend money to the government, money that taxpayers repay with interest, creating a cycle that drains ordinary people to benefit the already powerful. Meanwhile, politicians avoid taxing either corporations or the stressed working class, since raising taxes risks electoral disaster. Eventually, this unsustainable arrangement hits a wall. The masses revolt, if not through revolution, then through political upheaval. Yet politicians cling to outdated dogmas about capitalism, refusing to question the system itself, even as it creates poverty and inequality on a massive scale. Karl Marx's insight 150 years ago remains painfully relevant. Capitalism's flaw isn't merely low wages or unfair conditions. It's the hierarchical employer-employee structure itself. So long as a small group controls the work of the many, power and wealth will concentrate at the top, perpetuating crises of poverty, war, and inequality. We cannot solve these problems without reimagining the workplace as a democratic institution, where decisions are made collectively, and each worker has a real voice, just as we once dared to imagine democracy replacing monarchy. If it worked in politics, it can work in the economy too. Americans are increasingly aware of this reality. Young people, in particular, see that neither Democrats nor Republicans offer real solutions. They see a system rigged against them, where free markets have exported jobs overseas, and government policies only serve corporations and the rich. Their frustration drives them to question capitalism itself, something almost unthinkable in America a generation ago. As long as we deny the real source of our problems, the employer-employee hierarchy of capitalism, we will remain stuck. But if we dare to challenge it, to build a democratic economy, we might finally find a way to lift everyone up, not just the privileged few.